All right, here we go, recording for podcast 24 at this point. I could count, but I'm not going to waste the time figuring out how many episodes I spent on Euthyphro. Only point is I spent a number of episodes on Euthyphro and then the Apology to really go through in detail to detail some of the things that Socrates is saying and providing context before and sort of after those words in order to fully explicate them. And if you've listened long enough, you can understand that some of what I'm doing is reading stuff from later passages into earlier passages so that you can better understand them, or including some context from later Platonic works. Alright, paused a little bit there, my fault. But anyway, this is podcast 24, and this is going to be another episode of Page of Plato. So as far as doing these sort of podcasts are concerned, again, what we're doing is we're reading a page or two or three or maybe sometimes as many as 4 or 5 of Plato at a time. The point being to do slow reads, to do deep dives on Plato, philosophy, Euthyphro, the Apology, Crito, Phaedo, maybe Meno, Republic, and Symposium, a few other dialogues. I should have mentioned, but I've got Plato's complete works edited by John M. Cooper over there, so now I have access to even more materials than I've had in the past, because this anthology is very good for Plato, but in certain respects it's limited. And compared to the Aristotle section in this book, nowhere near as limited, but certain dialogues such as Timaeus in particular are given in part, whereas there's a fuller version of them. So this book covers a lot of Plato without covering him in full. But again, we're not necessarily covering Plato in full here. What we're doing is we're doing close reads of the earlier dialogues. Again, that opinion of them being early dialogues being, like I said, it's an opinion. It's based on certain rationale that I, broadly speaking, agree with in terms of certain of the dialogues seeming to have more of a historical basis in terms of literal events that may have happened, as opposed to simply being hypothetical formats or forums rather for discussion. So, but I've realized as I'm going through this, you can extend those arguments as far as Euthyphro, which I usually regard as one of the early dialogues, part of the tragedy of Socrates sort of progression, basically the first dialogue you ought to read, and that's why I started with it. And then chronologically, it makes sense as a story to go from Euthyphro through the Apology, and then into Crito, where we're going to start today. And let's see. I guess in this one, we're not going to go past much more than 2-3 pages, because again, we really want to chew on this material. But I would make the argument that these dialogues in particular, Euthyphro, Crito, Apology, and probably Phaedo as well, my assumption is that they, relatively speaking, are transmitting events that actually happened. So to spell out what that means in this case, I'm saying that that the Euthyphro incident likely happened in terms of him having a discussion with Euthyphro, going into the court or coming out of it, whatever the sequencing is, because we discussed that seems slightly unclear, but whatever the sequencing is, it's clearly close in time proximity to him getting his charges laid against him. And so unless you want to, again, I think you can really make the argument, though, that there's no real evidence, so you can't just suppose that anything Plato said actually happened and then point to his age and a few other things and say well, was Plato following Socrates around with a tape recorder all day? Otherwise, the reporting of, is this in the Apology, is that really Socrates's verbatim defense of himself? Does Xenophon potentially report the defense more accurately? We might have to do an episode where we do a page of Xenophon and go through Xenophon's trial in order to analyze that. But that, again, seems a bit afield because what we care about most here is not even... this will sound strange, but it's not what's going on in the story. It's not the facts. It's the ideas that Socrates gets to at so many different points. And that's why we would stick with the Platonic material, is just that, intellectually speaking, it's the stronger material. It's the material worth going over. And Xenophon, you may learn historical details, but again, I think we're here to consider ideas. And so, having gone from, Euthyphro, which I guess you can argue one way or the other that the Euthyphro is either a historical rendition of what happened, or it's Plato's imagination. If you argue it's Plato's imagination, I think the only thing somebody would then say to you, and it's kind of what I said over the course of all the Apology podcasts, but, you do have to be smart enough to look at Plato himself, in this case, writing his Apology, which is Socrates' Apology, but it's really Plato's Apology because it's Plato's dialogue, and understand the age he was at the time, certain of other factors, his mentor being put to death, all these other things make you think that perhaps the rendition in the Apology is perhaps not a verbatim recording. It's not a court recording. It's not a tape. It's not objective necessarily. So that that's something to consider. But again, we've gone through the Apology and but in going through the Apology, we've gone through in detail all of the things that Socrates said, all the context behind them. So that is the point of this sort of podcast style page of Plato, and that's what I want to continue to do here with Crito. And again, like I'm saying along these lines, though, this dialogue appears to be a rendition of some sort of historical event. Now, again, if you want to make an argument, maybe Euthyphro, not a historical event, but Apology, and Crito, historical events, but Phaedo, not a historical event, or, there's different arguments I think could be made, and made with evidence in their favor. So that's to be considered. But I think for me, the opinion that I'm taking here is relatively simple, and it's that when we're talking about these tragedy of Socrates dialogues, and particularly Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Phaedo, we're discussing things that I'm going to assume happened, and certain difficulties of that. Again, why you can maybe argue against Phaedo is just the fact that whether or not Plato's present in the Crito discussion, he certainly wasn't present at the Phaedo discussion. So again, that's where we start to stretch the line between faithful rendition of what Socrates said versus using Socrates as a mouthpiece for some of Plato's most powerful ideas that he expressed in any dialogue ever. So there's reasons to have some skepticism about Phaedo, Crito less so along those lines. So, but again, we're taking this from the point of view of just granting without a ton of skepticism that these discussions did in fact happen roughly as they're recorded, and then going through them to consider the content of it. So to start off in Crito, and again, to put you in context here, Plato's Apology, Socrates' Apology, his defense of himself in court, This has happened already. He has defended himself. He has proposed the penalty of being treated like an Olympic athlete. He's provoked them. He's made prophecies about what will happen to the city of Athens because of their condemning him. And then at the end, he spoke to the people who voted to acquit him about his opinions on death and why he essentially doesn't fear it and isn't concerned that this is an evil that can be done to him. So, taking that all in context, what's important to note as we're carrying into Crito, because in these Platonic dialogues you can get a little bit lost in the discussion that's going on at the time and forget a lot of the context of it. But you'll essentially in this dialogue hear Crito and a bunch of other people, they're telling Socrates they want him to escape. They're offering him means to escape. They're encouraging him to escape. And Socrates is going to go through and rejoinder them as far as, why would I want to escape? Did you not hear all of the things that I said in defense of myself at my trial? And essentially kind of raising the question, have you guys been paying attention at all? Do you understand the teachings, if there are teachings at all, that I've tried to impart on to you all? Or in Socrates' case, he said he's not trying to teach people anything. He's trying to examine himself and others for wisdom in an attempt to find somebody wiser than himself. And so basically you can make, again, like I talked about last time, you can make certain analogies between Socrates and Jesus, and among those analogies is the sort of doubting Thomas, skeptical followers sort of issue, where they have disciples around them that are clearly very much, if not, I wanted to say loyal, and then that's not the right word, and then adherent, and that's also not quite the right word. I would say devoted is definitely a good word, though. And these people are very much devoted to Socrates, and so you would argue people like Crito, Plato, people who are mentioned in Apology in particular, these people are well aware of the philosopher Socrates is, and this is why they associate with him. Then again, their lack of understanding, very much analogous to Jesus' disciples, where, part of the point of Christianity, anybody who grew up in any of the churches, especially the Catholic churches, is just well aware that, the disciples were obstinately incapable of understanding the message that Jesus was trying to impart to them, which was, I'm going to be killed, I'm going to come back, and therefore, basically it's like, you don't need to fear my death. And that's why, I think there's so many similarities between the two historical figures of having not a contempt for their death, but a lack of fear. Although Garden of Gethsemane, who knows, but not the, again, that's judging somebody who was crucified. So, not to use the word Jesus in terms of judging myself, but be a little less judgmental. But it just that there's analogies to be drawn there. And then when you consider the fact, spoiler alert, sorry, religious people, but certain things in history happened before certain of the things recorded in the Bible. Socrates executed 399 BC. Jesus executed around 33 AD. Therefore, about 400 years of historical separation. But when you consider the historical context of things, you look at, for example, Socrates, as we saw at the end of Apology and stuff, living in a world so shaped by the works of Homer and Hesiod, and in particular, when you look at the works of Homer and why it had gained the popularity that it had, you realize that, among other things, it's because of the Pan-Athenaean festival, where they sort of officially recorded a copy of Homer so that they could continue to perform it over and over again, and that's what sort of officialized it. That's what makes the Iliad and the Odyssey kind of an Athenian phenomenon in the sense that they didn't create the story, but they wrote it down. And so I'm saying all this to say, the historical period between the historical Homer, if he existed, maybe like talking about the historical Shakespeare or some shit, but, the period between Homer, roughly Greek Dark Ages, so, somewhere around 8 to 700 BC, or not, somewhere between 900 BC and 700, probably closer to around 750 to 800, but I'm not giving you the precise date because I don't have it off the top of my head, which is my fault, but scholars will point things out about Homer. In particular, they'll point to certain things that are seemingly more of an indication of his current culture than any sort of reporting on the Mycenaean culture that came before him. But then again, the horse crest helmets and these other things are indications too and chariot warfare, indications of a world from prior to the period in which Homer was either performing, creating his stories, whatever you want to refer to it as. And that just means, in a world of Socrates, which is so largely shaped by that ideology is not that much farther removed from Socrates as Socrates is removed from Jesus historically. And so that's just important to note that if you hear me when we're going through dialogues like Phaedo and stuff, start to point out that Plato and maybe arguably Socrates himself were some of the true progenitors of not Christianity, but a push towards a monotheism that I guess you'll see expressed in sort of the Neoplatonists and stuff as well. This emphasis on the concept of the one and the one versus the many, so sort of the plurality and the lack of stability of the many versus the one, which is kind of a Parmenidean sort of concept that reality really doesn't change. The only thing that changes is kind of our impressions, which are illusory, etc. But again, I've gotten slightly afield because all I'm doing is trying to introduce Crito, and I'm almost to 20 minutes already. But just to putting in context, to say some of Jesus' his ideas, you can really argue they were influenced indirectly, obviously, because I doubt Jesus had the capacity or the inclination to read the works of Plato, and that's just an assumption, but I think it's a pretty strong assumption based on Plato being an Athenian writer, academic, etc., the separation in time, the regional difference between living in ancient Judea as opposed to living in ancient Greece, how much contact was there between ancient Greece and in the Judean state, such that you can really say that there would have been a transmittal of the written material of Plato to the region, such that what we know of Jesus historically was he was either a carpenter or a mason, so similar, I guess, to Socrates in that sense too. And therefore, if we know that about him, we can kind of surmise that he was likely not a rich man. Therefore, not being a rich man, you can then further suppose, if not illiterate, which doesn't seem like he was illiterate, then, pretty good argument to be made that it's unlikely that he was intimately familiar with the works of Plato. And if you're making the argument that Plato influenced the development of monotheism in the region, etc., it's really not that hard to make the argument, and you can make it in more indirect ways, where you basically say that through the influence of Greek culture, more generally speaking, rather than specifically, Jesus or one of his homies picking up Plato's Euthyphro and being like, well, there's a lot of good ideas in here. You can come to a more, I think, sort of a logical approach to analyzing that, where basically like the osmosis of the ideas over time may have trickled into the region through Greek cultural influence, and then that Greek cultural influence transmitted itself, and then the ideas were transformed over time, and therefore, you don't need a direct link to establish that there may have been some influence from somebody such as Plato, who seems to have been articulating something so close to the eventual Christian ideology that you just have to wonder what the influence was, etc. So that's just some context to say Socrates has been condemned to death, sentenced to death, convicted, all these things, and now we're here in Crito, and Socrates is in jail. He's in prison because basically, I don't think the Athenians had a true policy of mass incarceration like we have in our modern society. Not to dive into that issue right now, but essentially, I don't think putting him in jail for extended period of time was considered feasible by anybody. So he's basically just being held until they execute him. And as we'll see in the dialogue, they're waiting to execute him because there's a bit of a ritual going on involving a ship that needs to return to Athens before he can be put to death. And so, basically what's going on is once they come back with that ship, Socrates will have to drink the hemlock, and therefore Socrates' homies know this is kind of their last chance to try and convince Socrates to flee. So that's where we start with Crito, which starts at 43 in the Greek pagination. So starts, Socrates, why have you come at this hour, Crito? Isn't it still early? It is indeed. About what time? Just before dawn. I'm surprised the prison warden was willing to let you in. He knows me now, Socrates. Come here so often, and besides, I've done him a good turn. Have you just arrived, or have you been here a while? Or quite a while. And why didn't you wake me up right away, instead of sitting there in silence? Said Crito, in the name of Zeus, Socrates, I wouldn't do that. I only wish I weren't so sleepless and distressed myself. I've been amazed all this time to see how peacefully you were sleeping, and I deliberately kept from awaking you, so that you could pass the time as pleasantly as possible. In the past, indeed throughout my entire life, I have often counted you happy in your disposition, but never more so than in this present misfortune. You bear it so easily and calmly. So again, pause here and chew on this paragraph a little bit, because there's nothing to chew on about him giving a turn to the fucking warden of the prison and shit. That doesn't matter, but what does matter, as we heard in the previous dialogue in Apology, Crito is one of Socrates' associates, and he's not one of his loose associates. This is one of Socrates' closest associates. So I had a professor in the past who seems like she had some sort of research project to go through these dialogues and to record sort of the social relations in a sort of mapped out way, where you could see it graphed out of, who knew who essentially in these societies. But that again, kind of in my mind triggered the question, how historical are these dialogues really? Are there people inserted here and there that weren't present at events, etc.? How much historical fidelity do we really have here? How necessary is that to get the full appreciation of what's going on here? But again, we got Crito, and like I said, Socrates is basically his disciple, and like Jesus' disciples, he's having a moment of weakness, a crisis of faith, where he's, he's sleepless, he's distressed, but he's essentially amazed at Socrates' attitude towards the whole thing. And, I think a lot of people have had the experience of not wanting to wake somebody up who seems like they're having a pleasant sleep. And so, again, here we've got a lot of elements here of essentially, Socrates or Plato rather, is doing, this, again, it's sort of a rhetorical technique where he mentions things that are so commonplace, these experiences, that it makes it feel more authentic. And then again, Crito also points out, I've often counted you happy, never more so in this present misfortune. And this is, I guess, a piece of evidence in favor of the argument that Socrates deliberately condemned himself in this matter in order to die, and was, relatively happy with the outcome. Yeah. So again, what we have here, really, just to sum it up, is we've got Crito essentially having a crisis of faith moment with his mentor, friend, and obviously it's distressing to know that your friend is going to be put to death, and you'll never be able to speak to them again. You're losing a connection, all these things. You can't hate on Crito for being so so distraught by it. But then again, and this goes to the Socratic irony versus the authenticity or the sincerity side of things, is based on what Socrates has said and will say, Socrates' opinions on these matters are relatively consistent in terms of he's not going to take excessive steps just to protect himself, essentially. He doesn't view that as a good. He only views as a good doing the right thing, and therefore he's not going to do something he thinks is either the wrong thing or potentially wrong in a circumstance like this. And therefore all of his friends are thinking 20 miles an hour about, we need to get him out of here, we need to take him here, we need to do this, we need to bribe this person, we need to do that. And Socrates is basically not concerned with that whatsoever, because he doesn't care. And so there's that. But we'll just continue with Socrates, because he rejoinders this pretty good when he says, well, Crito, it would be an error for someone of my age to complain when the time has come when he must die. So again, not necessarily that Socrates is trying to die, but he's clearly of the opinion that being put to death at his age is not the worst thing that could happen to somebody. And Crito responds, other people get overtaken by such misfortunes too, Socrates. Their age doesn't prevent them in the least from complaining about their fate. So, as we'll see throughout this dialogue, Crito is a clever guy, even though he's not necessarily the sharpest or the best interlocutor of all time. He says very interesting things, including basically, Socrates says, well, it'd be an error to complain because I'm so old. And then Crito points out there's other old people that don't, aren't prevented from complaining about anything and everything. And Socrates responds, that's right. Tell me, why have you come so early? Crito says, bring bad news, Socrates. Not bad in your view, it seems to me, but bad and hard in mine and that of all your friends, and hardest of all, I think, for me to bear. What news is that? Or has the ship returned from Delos, at whose return I must die? So, to read this note that's going over this anecdotal thing about the ship returning from Delos, and for any of you who've played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you know that sailing from Delos to Athens is not doesn't take very long at all, and therefore a ship returning from Delos is bound to return relatively soon, and Socrates is well aware that when it returns, he must die. So then, and remember we mentioned last time with Crito, or with Apology rather, Socrates mentions certain true jurors, especially in Hades, and he mentions Minos as one of them, and Minos clearly was the king of Crete, and as we're going to see in this note, he's integrally involved with the legend that the Athenians are celebrating with their ship ritual. And so, go through it. Legend had it that Athens was once obligated to send King Minos of Crete an annual tribute of 7 young men and 7 maidens to be given to the Minotaur, a monster, half man, half bull, that he kept in a labyrinth with the help of a thread given to him by Minos' daughter Ariadne, Theseus, a legendary king of Athens, made his way through the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, and escaped, thus ending the tribute. Each year, Athens commemorated these events by sending a mission of thanks to the sanctuary of Apollo on the sacred island of Delos. No executions would take place in Athens until the mission returned from its voyage. So, again, even these notes we're going to chew on here. So, one thing that's interesting about this is noting the fact that Socrates seems to have regarded Minos as a true juror, even though, clearly he's slightly vilified by the Athenians as far as being the powerful king to whom the Athenians were forced to pay this human sacrifice tribute. It also is important to note that this is a myth about human sacrifice and bringing a practice of human sacrifice to an end. Story of Athenian throwing off of a foreign power, legendary king of Athens, Theseus, and Ariadne, who is eventually, I believe, the wife of Dionysus, when Dionysus essentially forces Theseus to abandon her on an island so he can claim her for himself. And again, these myths of the Greeks are so fucking weird and, just strange, and the sort of thing that you would definitely expect somebody like a Socrates to have pushed against to some degree, and I think he might have. But then more details that are sort of interesting here, and again, this is why I'm glad I briefly went over that Iliad context stuff to show you how integral Apollo is to that story and here, and that's why arguably Apollo and Poseidon are two of the original Greek gods, and Zeus is kind of an added in after the fact sort of imposition of a more traditional sky god on the pantheon, rather than Apollo and Poseidon essentially maybe gods that were worshipped at a more ancient period earlier on, whatever it is. But clearly, the sanctuary of Apollo on Delos, which is very important to the Athenians, or at least it was, and it was even more important when they had a treasury on Delos with the Delian League, which was supposed to be an alliance of sorts between the Greek states in order to resist ostensibly Persian influence and Persian incursions, but then quickly devolved after the Athenians basically kicked the Spartans out of the alliance, and then it became basically the Athenian Empire. So again, the Athenians have a very close association with Apollo, just like Odysseus, I would argue. Apollo has a lot to do with his story. And so, like the note says, no executions could take place in Athens until the mission returned from its voyage. See Phaedo 58.3 through C5 if you want to know more about that. So Crito continues, no, it hasn't returned yet, meaning the ship. I think it will arrive today, judging from the reports of people who've come from Sunium, where they left it. So that's a headland on the southeast coast of Attica, about 30 miles from Athens. It's clear from these reports that it will arrive today, and so tomorrow, Socrates, you must end your life. Socrates, I pray that it may be for the best. Crito, if it pleases the gods, let it be so. All the same, I don't think it will arrive today. What evidence have you of that? I'll tell you, I must die on the day after the ship arrives. That's what the authorities say, at least. That's Crito saying that. And Socrates, then I don't think it will arrive today, but tomorrow. My evidence for this comes from a dream I had in the night a short while ago. So it looks as though you chose your right time to not wake me. What was your dream? I thought a beautiful, graceful woman came to me, robed in white. She called to me and said, Socrates, you will arrive in fertile Thea on the third day. And that's a quote from Iliad, book 9, line 363. And so we are certainly going to take the opportunity to dive right into the Iliad and try to find that quote. And so, pardon me if we pause for a little. I think there's things to chew on here, but looking for 363. There we go. So this quote is from the Iliad. So we're doing close reads. So to so what's going on here in this context? So Odysseus, and here goes Odysseus again, and I just can't believe that Socrates is quoting passages from this and doesn't have some sort of inclination that Odysseus is there, that the context is basically an envoy has been sent to Achilles to try and get him to rejoin the war after Agamemnon disrespected him, and Odysseus leads this delegation along with Ajax, and they send Grandpa Simpson, Old Man Nestor, along with them as well. And so they all go pleading to Achilles. They've got tribute and this, that, and the other thing. And then Achilles basically, he does his characteristic Achilles hero thing where in his version of the hero, if Achilles believes something to be basically wrong, he can't do it even if it's beneficial to him. So they come to him with all these sorts of gifts, and he won't accept them because he's basically like, the matter is essentially moral to me. It's a matter of honor. It's not a matter of prizes. And even though it was about prizes at the beginning, it's like the baseball player who says, it wasn't about the money. It was about the respect in contract negotiation. So that's sort of the context here that, I'm going to read Socrates' quote again, where Socrates, you will arrive in fertile Thea on the third day. And when we read the quote in the Iliad, so to read the whole paragraph in the Iliad, but as it is, I now have no desire to fight godlike Hector. So this is Achilles talking. So tomorrow I'm going to sacrifice to Zeus and all the other gods, then load and launch my ships. First thing in the morning, if you want to and are interested, you will see my ships crossing the teeming Hellespont and my men straining at the oar. In 3 days, given a good crossing by Poseidon, I will be home in fertile Thea. I have great wealth there, which I left behind when, to my cost, I came here. Now I will enrich it further by what I bring back: the gold, the red copper, the well-girdled women, and the gray iron that fell to me as my ordinary share of booty. For what it's worth, but the prize he gave me, he humiliatingly withdrew. That's what the Lord Agamemnon did to me, that son of Atreus. Tell him all I say, and tell him in public. Then the rest of the army can make their feelings clear. When he tries to cheat any other Greek, he is utterly shameless, but still the dog cannot even bring himself to look me in the eye. He'll get no advice or action from me. He has cheated me and played me false. He won't take me in again. Once is enough. He can go to hell in his own good time. Zeus, wise in his counsel, has removed his brains. I hate his gifts and value him at one splinter. Not if he gave me 20 or 10 times as much as he possesses or could raise elsewhere, or all the revenues of Orchomenus or Thebes, Egyptian Thebes, where the houses are stuffed with treasure, and through every one of 100 gates 200 warriors ride out with their chariots and horses. Not if he gave me gifts numerous as grains of sand or specks of dust, would Agamemnon ever win me over, until he has paid back the whole heart-rending insult. I'm marrying no daughter of Agamemnon, son of Atreus. She could be as lovely as golden Aphrodite and as skilled as gray-eyed Athena. I would still not marry her. Can choose some other Greek for her, someone on his own exalted plane, more elevated than me. If the gods allow me to safely get home, my father Peleus will, I am sure, find me a wife. Up and down Hellas and Thea, there are plenty of Greek girls, daughters of nobles, who protect their towns. I have only to choose the one I want and make her my own. There were often times at home when my heart's own desire was to make some well-matched girl my lawful wife and enjoy the fortune my old father Peleus has made. For nothing, as I see it now, equals the value of life, not the wealth they say prosperous Ilium possessed in earlier days when there was peace before the coming of the Greeks, nor all the treasure piled up behind the stone threshold of Phoebus Apollo and rocky Delphi. Cattle and fat sheep can be lifted, tripods and chestnut horses can be procured, but you cannot lift or procure a man's life once the breath has left his lips. My divine mother, silver-footed Thetis, says that destiny has left two courses open to me on my journey to the grave. If I stay here and fight it out round Ilium, there's no coming home for me. There will be eternal glory instead. If I go back to the land of my fathers, my heroic glory will be forfeit, but my life will be long, and I shall be spared an early death. And another thing, I would encourage all the rest of you to sail for home too. You are never going to reach your goal. In the streets of Ilium, far-thundering Zeus has stretched out a protective hand over that town, and its people have taken heart. So leave me now and report my message to the Greek leaders freely, as is the privilege of advisors. Then they can think up some better way of shaving the ships and all their troops beside them, since this plan, which they thought up as a result of my implacable anger, will not work. But Phoenicus can stay here and spend the night with us. Then he can embark home with me in the morning if he wants to. There will be no compulsion. So he spoke and was received in complete silence by them all. The bluntness of his words had taken them completely by surprise. Eventually the old charioteer Phoenix spoke up, bursting into tears, so afraid was he for the ships. And I don't want to continue here because, again, Grandpa Simpson's going to start telling stories about himself and Heracles and every other friggin' one. And what he does, though, is he he makes an analogy story between another hero and that guy's wife, Cleopatra, and Cleopatra being essentially Patroclus backwards, if you know the Greek well enough, because it's Patro and Cleo, the glory of the father. So Cleopatra or Patroclus is basically the same word, front or back, and basically a male and female equivalent, kind of like Cassandra is the female equivalent of the word Alexander, etc., etc., etc. So some interesting things is Socrates is quoting from the Iliad here, and we may stop right here and just chew on this as far as the Iliad context of this, because I just do think it's interesting that Socrates is here clearly quoting Achilles, and therefore you can argue he's making an analogy between himself and Achilles. Now, when I've said that we need to understand Odysseus's character in order to fully understand Socrates in context, this is one of the things I'm talking about, where Socrates doesn't mention this. He only gives the quote. He doesn't even say it's coming from Achilles, but then again, if you know the context, you know this comes from Achilles, and then you know Achilles is talking to Odysseus, he's talking to Phoenix, he's talking to Ajax, he's talking to all these people, and Ajax at the end will just get angry with him, basically like, there's nothing we can say to get this craven back on our side, all these, and then Achilles basically only appreciates the things he says because Ajax basically brings no pretense to the game. There's no, stories about what I did in the past as far as old Grandpa Simpson, aka Nestor, is going to do. But that guy just speaks to him bluntly and is basically like, hey, you coward, like, if you're not going to fight with us, what's the difference between you and a coward, sort of thing. And he basically appreciates what he has to say, but as Achilles gives in his rendition of the prophecy from Thetis to him, Achilles is well aware if he stays at Troy, he will die. He knows this for a fact, and he's pointed out that, so where did he say this in particular? Because I want to read this in particular, that because he mentions the value. So yes, for nothing as I now see it equals the value of life. So he basically mentions that wealth and stuff is not worth more to him than his life. And he points out that, unlike other people, potentially, he has the certainty of the prophecy from his mother, that he's well aware that there's only two courses for him, and it's either fight it out and get your glory, or retreat with no glory and remain safe and live to a ripe old age and all these sort of things. And but Achilles is, he talks about the value of life in a way that's very different from the value of life that Socrates had. So again, he's not exactly putting himself in saying every opinion of Achilles is an opinion of mine, but just interesting to look at the similarities, these people having their discussions with Socrates, as they will in this dialogue and in Phaedo, where there's more people present. They're trying to convince him. They're almost like the envoys to Achilles, and like that envoy is going to be unsuccessful. In the context of the Iliad, though, what's going to happen is that, so Achilles says, for nothing as now I see it equals the value of life. But the way he sees things at that present time, Patroclus is still alive, and it's going to make a big old difference when Patroclus is killed. And, Patroclus is killed basically because he doesn't follow Achilles' instructions. Achilles basically says, well, I'm going to send you out in my armor. You're going to inspire the troops. You're going to win. You're going to do this. You're never going to take the city of Troy. That's my glory alone. And, of course, that's not actually his glory, because he will die before the city falls. And then they'll have to go get his son, Neoptolemus, and bring him to the city in order to finally sack the city. And then Achilles' son will commit some of the worst war crimes in the whole thing. But not to dive too deeply into that. But again, we've got to acknowledge and understand this analogy where, so if he's saying, Socrates, you will arrive in fertile Thea on the third day, when Achilles says that he's going to arrive on fertile Thea, and he says, first thing in the morning, you'll see my ships crossing the Hellespont. In 3 days, given a good crossing by Poseidon, I'll be home in fertile Thea. So Achilles is laying out what will happen if he goes home, and he's saying, and again, remember what I said, Delos is not that far away from Athens, friggin' Achilles is telling them, I'll be home in Thea in 3 days, which is pretty far away from where Troy is. So he's having to sail, I believe, almost as far, if not farther, than even Odysseus has to. And so, he's got a long way to go, but he's basically saying, 3 days from now, I'll be at home, and I'll be safe. I'll be safe for the rest of my life, so what do you have to say to me that really is going to convince me that it's worth my time to, sacrifice my life, which I know I'll have to do in order to win glory to be here? And what Achilles is pointing out, he's saying, and it's true for him, and it's sort of pointing at, I guess, the later sort of Aristotle point of this, that, wealth and all these material things, they can't be the good, because essentially their enjoyment is transient, and then once you're dead, they're no good to you anyway. So all these treasures and women and things that he could get, he's basically saying, well, I could get them in a lot of different places, and even when I get them, it won't make a difference for me at the end of the day. And so, again, him quoting, saying, Socrates, you will arrive in fertile Thea on the third day, sort of twisting the thing, saying Socrates is going to arrive home and safe. So this sort of goes to his opinion on death, where he thinks he's going to be in Hades and examining people, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we're not going to begrudge him of his belief. We're just going to point out he's using this as a metaphor for either reaching the Isle of the Blessed, or whatever the situation is that he thinks is going to be. But again, to chew on it a little bit more, it's just interesting that somebody such as Socrates, who seems so devoted to an intellectual and rigorous way of understanding things, he's convinced by a dream. And that's just worthy of note, that means that Socrates put at least some stock in the content of his dreams, which to say he's the only person who's done that in human history is not true. There's a lot of people who've done that. But I think anybody in a modern context would understand trying to do dream analysis is, I have a really rude word in mind to use to describe that sort of behavior, but to say it's beyond stupid is an understatement. So the idea that he, could say that he knows about these things, at least he says, I don't think it will arrive. He doesn't say he knows that the thing won't arrive. So even though he says the meaning is quite clear, at least it seems so to me. But again, to have a beautiful, graceful woman robed in white tell you you're going to arrive in fertile Thea on the third day, again, it's this sort of clever thing that religious people do, where they will quote some random quote from the Bible just to sort of demonstrate their knowledge and to make you aware, essentially, of how well read they are. And then you read the quote yourself and you say, well, that doesn't say exactly what you said it does, because, Socrates, you're going to die, whereas Achilles, if he arrives in fertile Thea, will be alive and will live a long life. So it's not the best analogy. And then again, it's like the religious person going to such lengths to quote from a book that really isn't necessarily even worth quoting from in general. But then, as I just read through the Iliad, you start to read and you say, well, now I'm starting to get a picture of why the Iliad was regarded as so important by this society. It's not just a book. Fucking read it for yourself if you don't believe me, but, read the Iliad and tell me it doesn't change your perspective on things like any good work of art is supposed to do. And so, that is to say, Socrates is making this sort of analogy, and I just think it's a bad analogy in the sense of he knows better. He likely knows better too. He likely actually would sort of, it would be interesting to get a full sort of Socratic take on Achilles, basically him considering Achilles in himself in the sort of Socratic style of, don't tell me about justice when you're telling me about piety. Tell me about the pious in itself. Let's talk about Achilles, the decisions he makes, etc., and the sort of example he is. But I think what Socrates is doing is he's saying the analogy between me and any sort of hero on the sort of heroic spectrum between Odysseus and Achilles, then we would say Socrates is on the Achilles side for various reasons. Number one, can't be convinced not to do something that's gonna, lead to his death or whatever. Can't, stubborn, set in his ways, devoted to a course of doing something because of a perception of the rightness of doing that thing, etc., etc., etc. Whereas on the other side, you see Odysseus, and this is why I'm interested in doing the quantitative and qualitative analysis of the entirety of the Iliad and the Odyssey, to go through and really see in every single case, what does he say, what does he not say, what's his sort of hierarchical position within the scene. As we see in book 1, he leads the envoy to Chryseis to bring Chryseis back to her father when Agamemnon had seized her, and all these sorts of things, where what you would say about Achilles or Odysseus in general, in contrast to Achilles, is Odysseus, in a certain sense, is the sort of Nietzschean overman. He is the person for whom morality is a secondary consideration at best. Odysseus is concerned first and foremost with himself, and then secondarily with anybody else. And somebody could essentially say Odysseus is essentially a rational hero, whereas Achilles is a more irrational hero, in that Achilles is set in a certain way, and then he's just going to follow that blindly, whereas Odysseus, because he's many-sided and he's polytropous and all these things that are used to describe him, he wanders. He's essentially somebody who's more cautious and careful, and therefore he's more able to, in particular, he survives the Trojan War, whereas Achilles does not. And in certain scenes, he's leading the army, but then in certain scenes, in particular, Diomedes, son of Tydeus, is fighting a battle against a bunch of Trojans, and then basically the entirety of the Greek army runs away, including Odysseus, and Diomedes calls out to Odysseus and basically like, son of Laertes, like, where are you running to? What are you doing? Like, you fucking coward, come back here and stand beside me. We're doing the same thing here. You need to help me. And it's notable that essentially Odysseus completely ignores him, doesn't respond to him, acts like he didn't hear anything, and continues running. And then in that case, Diomedes is saved. There's sort of an intervention of Athena, and then he has just this giant set of battles. I think that's when he fights Aphrodite and a bunch of I may be mixing that up with another battle, but the point is Diomedes does survive in that circumstance, but the argument to be made and what Plato or what Homer is implying is Odysseus would not have survived had he turned back and done what Diomedes asked him to do. And then I would argue there's an analogy between that and the decision by Odysseus to turn back at the Isle of Tenedos, the island of Apollo, which again, we're hearing the word Apollo so many times throughout this. It's such a big turning point for all of these different characters. But again, I think if Odysseus were consistent in his character, if he did the same thing every time, then he would have continued at Tenedos, would have reached home safely, and then boom, there's no Odyssey. He's not a hero. But what sort of makes him a hero is the fact that he's polytropous. He's many-sided. And again, I think this is why Greek culture in general, they look at the Achilles to Odysseus spectrum, and most of them locate themselves somewhere closer to the Odysseus side of things, where they all recognize it's like, first of all, I'm no Achilles. I'm not the greatest, hugeness, all these things. Like, I'm not that, you're not him sort of thing. And then there's also the recognition, though, maybe I can be more like Odysseus, I just have to be more clever. And then that's a society then sort of more so idolizing the character who is their primary attribute is their intelligence, not necessarily their physical strength, even though, right, there's going to be this revelation in the Odyssey when all the suitors of Penelope try to basically tug on Superman's cape, but they try to string Odysseus's longbow, and they can't even pull it back because they're not strong enough, whereas Odysseus comes back and he strings that bow to shoot people with it because it's a weapon, so they couldn't even, and even his son Telemachus isn't able to string the bow, although he comes pretty close, and Odysseus is the only one strong enough. And so there's this sort of analogy of the heroic age and then the age we live in, and sort of making divine almost these characters like Odysseus, these heroes, but then the nuances of the sort of scale between, a Zeus and an Achilles, and then an Odysseus, where it's notable in the Iliad, sort of here and elsewhere, Achilles has a certain understanding of himself in relation to Zeus. In particular, he's aware that he's asked his mother to go directly to Zeus and to plead on his behalf, which he knows will be effective since Zeus is essentially bound by fear to not have sex with Achilles' mother, because the son of Thetis will be greater than the father, and therefore if Zeus has the child with her, he will surpass Zeus in sort of the same way that the male child of Metis was going, basically the brother of Athena, who I believe lives because he swallowed the goddess Zeus did, and so the goddess lives within him. So does that God who may emerge to split him open and be. It's weird. Again, Greek religion is not rational, but it's still interesting that you've got Zeus, who is the master of the universe and the causer of all things, even though you've got people going and, they wait for 12 days for the motherfucker to come back from a festival in Africa, which, why do gods need time to travel to and from places? Doesn't make a lot of sense, but then Zeus comes back and Thetis goes to him and kneels before him and grasps him by the knee and supplicates him and gets what she wants, which she basically asks Zeus. She says, basically, make things really hard for the Greeks until they've restored honor to my son. And as Achilles is sort of pointing out in the envoy scene, it's not going to be possible basically in a material sense to recompensate him. His compensation has to be something more on an honor sort of basis. And based on one of the things Achilles said in that scene, you can say arguably when he says, Agamemnon didn't even have the courage to show up in person, what he's implying is that if Agamemnon had shown up in person, if he had basically apologized to Achilles to his face and admitted that he was wrong, that may have actually that may have been worth more to Achilles than Briseis, more to him than the treasure, all this sort of things. But Achilles points out, and that was never going to happen, and you can tell why. The king doesn't go before one of his subjects and apologize. That's not kingly behavior. But again, that's sort of somebody's status getting in the way of the thing that they're there to do. Because Agamemnon, he's not there to rule the Greeks. He's there to besiege the city of Troy, take its treasure, and take it home with him. He's trying to be a conquering hero. And what does Agamemnon need to be a conquering hero? He fucking needs Achilles in his damn army. Because what's going on for this scene is the Greeks are having a hard time on the battlefield because Achilles is withdrawn from the battlefield. And when he comes back onto the battlefield, where Achilles first returns to the battlefield, and he's basically completely unarmored except for he's got a helmet on, I think, and then he basically screams at the top of his lungs, and the fire of either Zeus or Athena appears above his head and terrifies the shit out of the Trojans, and they were right at the ships, right about to light them all on fire, which then the Greeks wouldn't have been able to sail home. Well, I'm talking about things that happened after the scene that I just read that Socrates is quoting from. And we're literally going to pause here on Crito. So we're going to come back to Crito responding, "What a strange dream," to Socrates. And we're going to go through them chewing on this. But I feel it's important for me to chew on this. And again, this is why it's good that I have the familiarity with the Homeric material to be able to exposit these sort of details to say, when Socrates says in 3 days I'll be in fertile Thea, it's not just some random metaphor of in 3 days I'm going to be in heaven. He's making a specific allusion to a specific something, and you've got to understand that context to fully appreciate all the things he's doing, the rhetorical tactics, this, that, and the other thing, to really understand what Socrates is doing in that scene. And so to chew, though, a little bit more on the Iliad that he's quoting from, again, to analyze Achilles, I said again, there's the sort of levels, hierarchical levels to the character of Zeus, god of gods, basically kind of analogous to the Persian king as far as king of kings, as Socrates briefly mentioned in Apology. Like Zeus is a supreme god among other gods who also do things such as putting on Aphrodite's belt in order to seduce him, as Hera does, and then that brings up the question, how can an all-powerful god be seduced, i.e. tricked in any way, so, sort of things, and therefore, is Greek religion irrational from its basis? Yes, it is, but let's not get distracted there. What's important, though, is whether or not it's logically consistent. They certainly believe that Zeus exercises an enormous influence in their lives, and they invoke him all the time. And from Zeus to Achilles, Zeus is bound by the fates, and the fates have determined that Achilles is to either die a glorious young death or live to a ripe old age with no glory. And that is sort of the dilemma that's been put before Achilles. In a modern context, we would say that's a false dichotomy, because aren't there more options if Achilles goes home? Although the issue is that, the reason why Achilles is so famous and his name is known even among the common people recognize the name Achilles to this day, mostly because it's now the term for the Achilles tendon, which who knows if other societies other than American English have done that sort of thing. But, the sort of legacy of Achilles is that if he had gone home, his glory would have been obliterated, in the sense that now nobody would remember who Achilles was. His legend would fade in the way most historical legends fade, where other than a few people, which is really, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Jesus of Nazareth, Socrates, Plato, a few of these people, everybody else gets forgotten. Miletus will be forgotten. Crito will be forgotten. Critobulus will be forgotten. Plato's brothers, Adamanthus and Glaucon, who are such big figures in Republic and are, for a philosopher like me, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm just participating in the process, but, I recognize who those people are when they're invoked in the Apology and stuff. Oh yeah, that's Plato's brothers and stuff. It's true that, this dilemma seems like it's a false dichotomy, but really it's not. And then within the context of the story that's going on, again, the Iliad starts in year 9 of the siege of the city, although they give some details of the ships and the landing, and they go back and forth, and it's not chronologically A to B to C, 1 to 2 to 3, first to second to third. There's a bunch of jumping around in the Iliad. But again, so Achilles saying, I'm going to launch my ships. You'll see them crossing the Hellespont. Again, this seems so different from what Socrates is talking about in terms of a ship coming back, a ship arriving, as opposed to ships departing. The ship departing being therefore a sign that Achilles is going to live his long life, as opposed to Socrates, the ship being the sign that his life is at an end. So that's the thing where you have to understand the context to understand how sophisticated this allusion by him is, no matter whether it's apt or not. But again, so Achilles points out, the prize he gave me, he humiliatingly withdrew. So again, I don't think that Socrates wants to make, and I think this is what's problematic, is these sorts of analogies to Achilles. I think he maybe points out at one point I think this may be Plato himself pointing out in Republic that he doesn't like a scene where Achilles cries or some shit like that, and just weirdly judgmental stuff, kind of like macho mentality, whatever. But Achilles says some emotional things here that I think quite clearly you can say, if Socrates is making an analogy between himself and Achilles, you would have to say the analogy is flawed, in the sense that Socrates' character, I would argue, his disposition is like Achilles, in the sense of, I think, the simplicity with which he proceeds forward. In other words, he doesn't say things to open up multiple possibilities and consider them. He proceeds forward in terms of, if he says something, he's not just trying to set it up for later. He's really chewing on each individual piece and really he's in the moment of each discussion that he's a part of. Whereas, and Achilles basically says, tell him all I say, tell him in public. So he says, I mean business when I say this. He is shameless. He's a dog, can't look me in the eye. He'll get no advice or action from me. He cheated me, played me false. He won't take me in again, fool me once. shame on you, sort of thing. Once is enough. He can go to hell in his own good time. So also basically being like, I will kill that man if I get him in my sights again. So don't bother wasting my time. I hate his gifts. And then he says, Agamemnon will never win me over until he has paid back the whole of the heart-rending insult, which again, arguably he can't pay back because he stole Briseis from Achilles, and we didn't even, it's not super important, the sequencing of, Achilles really, according to the stories, tricking Agamemnon into taking Chryses, whereas he would have likely claimed Briseis for himself. Achilles plays a trick on him where he doesn't reveal Briseis and tricks Agamemnon into taking Chryses, which then Agamemnon is forced to give up Chryses when Chryses, the priest of Apollo, comes for his daughter, and Agamemnon initially doesn't want to give her, says she's going to grow old at my loom in Mycenae, etc., etc. I prefer her to my own wife, weird though that may sound, and then, spoiler alert, Agamemnon is eventually killed for this, among other behavior, by his wife Clytemnestra when he comes home, and that's a big part of the Orestia trilogy. But Achilles is saying, paid back the whole of the heart-rending insult. So theoretically, there is a way for this to be resolved, but it's not going to be resolved by the giving of gifts, giving of money. Basically, words and material things don't really matter to Achilles, but then again, to point certain things out that are relevant from the Iliad context that, again, lend into sort of, is Socrates really making an analogy between himself and Achilles? Is that a good analogy? Is Socrates actually closer to Odysseus in character in terms of sort of the sharpness of his wit and the ability to sort of see the results of the arguments that he's making in real time, in terms of being able to anticipate arguments that will come up as a result of sort of the admissions that people will give to him in the course of dialectic, etc. But to repeat another sort of a little note here. So again, my divine mother, silver-footed Thetis, says that destiny has left two courses open to me on my journey to the grave. If I stay here and fight it out round Ilium, there is no homecoming for me, no nostos for me, but there will be eternal glory of Kleos instead. If I go back to the land of my fathers, heroic glory will be forfeit, my life will be long, shall be spared an early death. And then he encourages all the rest of you to sail for home too. You are never going to reach your goal. In the steep streets of Ilium, far thundering Zeus has taken out a protecting hand over that town, and its people have taken heart. So, to analyze that here, what Achilles is saying is, right, this is sort of the problem of knowledge, a little bit of like what the Gettier problem and other things sort of getting at, but, Achilles is saying here, I would encourage all the rest of you to sail for home too, and he has good reason to think that. The reason he thinks that is, well, I'm leaving. If I'm leaving, you all should leave with me. And if I leave, fuck Agamemnon. Don't stay here with him. He's not gonna save you. Therefore, you're never gonna reach your goal. And that's what he thinks. Achilles thinks, and Achilles thinks he's gonna be the one to take down Troy, although he knows he's gonna die there. So what does he actually think he's going to accomplish? He thinks, for example, that Patroclus can't take the city of Troy because that's for him to do. but then in reality, he also will not take the city of Troy, regardless of sort of the prolific nature of his fighting. He fights that river god, and even though the river god is going to kill him, he eventually defeats the river god and all these sorts of things. And so, he's right and he's wrong. He's right that he should encourage the people to sail for home, and he's also right that far thundering Zeus has stretched out a protecting hand over that town. Its people have taken heart. But even though he's correct, he clearly doesn't have knowledge, at least not in the Platonic sense of it, because he doesn't understand that far thundering Zeus only has the protective hand over the town of Troy because he is being disrespected. In other words, though Zeus valued Troy and it's his favorite city and yada yada yada, which you can know that from the scene with Hera, where Hera says you can destroy any of my favorite cities, but I really want to get after your favorite here, Troy. And again, I think it's because the son of Zeus is one of the kings of Troy, or etc., etc., etc. But basically, Achilles throughout the Iliad is constantly in the position of having much more knowledge than the average person, even the average person in that Greek army. So compare him to Achilles, for example. Achilles is present when Agamemnon is disrespecting Achilles, and when he seizes Briseis from him, and he's there for when Achilles is going to kill Agamemnon, is restrained by Athena. But the difference is, even though Odysseus is somebody who will eventually have the favor of Athena, him and other people, in the Iliad it's really Tydeus, or not Tydeus, son of Tydeus, Diomedes has the real blessing of Athena as far as battlefield prowess, him and Ajax do. But like the Athena seizes Achilles by the hair before he's going to draw his sword and kill Agamemnon, does so because Achilles, being a demigod, has the ability to sort of peer through the mist, to use sort of a Percy Jackson sort of analogy. He can sort of see through to the divine world. However, one thing I think we can say then is if he sees through to the divine world, he doesn't see the most clearly. So Athena, he sees clearly, and he understands what she says, where she says to him, basically, be patient, don't kill him, say whatever you want, but withdraw, and we will reward you. You will get what you're looking for in terms of you will have your vengeance sort of thing. And so he does follow Athena's advice, but it's not because he fully has it in his mind of how it's going to play out. So we can say that Achilles sometimes acts on the basis of partial divine knowledge. And then in this case too, what he says, sorry, I closed the book and need to reopen it real quick to get back there. But he says, far thundering Zeus has stretched out a protecting hand over that town. That's true. Zeus is protecting them, and Zeus is favoring the Trojans. That's what's going on right now. That's why the Greek ships are threatened. So that's true. Its people have taken heart. That's also true. However, when he says you are never going to reach your goal in the steep streets of Ilium, that is literally not true. And even though it's not given, the story is not given in the Iliad, because people might not know, but the fall of Troy is not chronicled in the Iliad. It's literally about the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon, and the story literally begins and stops with that dispute as far as when this dispute began, and then when the dispute is resolved as far as when Patroclus finally has his funeral games, and they go through these rituals and they finally seriously reconcile. And so by the end of the Iliad, what's sort of creatively brilliant is Achilles has not died. However, if you've read the story, you know fully well that Achilles will die, that he is destined to die, that he has not taken the safe route of living to a ripe old age. So you know he will die, but they don't show that to you on screen. They show you Patroclus dying and Hector and all these other people, but not Achilles himself. And so you don't necessarily know that even though he tells them that they're never going to reach their goal, spoiler alert, they do. And actually, the way they achieve their goal at the end of the day, among other things, they eventually have to go, they have to go get a soldier they left on an island because of a snake bite. They've got to steal the palladium from Athena's sanctuary. And another thing they need to do is they need to go get Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, or Neoptolemus, so new warrior, essentially. They called him Pyrrhus as well for redhead, because that was characteristic of Achilles. And they go get him, and then Pyrrhus helps lead them to victory in Troy, something Patroclus and Achilles never did. And again, like I said, he commits war crimes, and does he or does he not reach home safely, blah, blah, blah. That's sort of given in the Odyssey, rather, and it's really in that scene where Odysseus is, he's been taken in by the Phaeacians, and he's telling the story basically of his, that's when he starts telling the Odyssey story, and he's telling them this whole story of the war, and therefore you get the context of the fall of the city, the things that Achilles said would never happen. So again, Achilles, the sort of more straight line, simpler motivation sort of guy in terms of being a hero, he does not survive the war, and also he has incorrect ideas about things that are going to happen fairly regularly. Incorrect idea number one, they're not going to ever take the city, but incorrect idea number two, and more important, I'm going to be able to send out Patroclus in my armor, and I'm going to be able to tell him not to try and take the city himself. That's my glory and mine alone. Yet Achilles is still sitting on the sidelines pouting like a baby, essentially, and then he sends his friend out to do the fighting for him, and then his friend goes out, fights very effectively, basically saves the Greek camp, which is what Achilles really needed him to do. But Achilles doesn't want Patroclus to die, and he tells him not to try and take the city of Troy because he knows that that's supposed to be his glory, although again, Achilles doesn't understand that's not his glory. So again, Achilles has certain understanding of things based on what he thinks are arrangements between him and Zeus, but as I learned in the ancient Greek hero class, Achilles has very much imperfect knowledge of these divine matters, and therefore he does the classic story thing of misinterpreting prophecies and therefore making them come true through his misinterpretations. And so, he causes Patroclus to die, which causes him to be in a rage, which causes him to rejoin the war. So in that sense, this envoy came trying to convince him to rejoin the war. But what will cause him to rejoin the war is nothing logical or, this will benefit you, Achilles, think about it. It's really irrational considerations of anger, and essentially Achilles thinks he has a deal with Zeus to protect Patroclus, and he prays on his behalf to Zeus to keep him safe. But what he doesn't understand is Zeus is going to grant part of his wish and not the other, and therefore Patroclus is going to die. And that's all to say, there's this classical contrast that I've alluded to between the Odysseus character and the Achilles character. And it's just really interesting that Socrates makes such a clear allusion to him being on the Achilles side of it, that then when you really chew on it and you analyze it and you look at all the things that Achilles did, you would say, especially in the fuller context, we'll probably get to this at some point, almost a 0% chance that Socrates would have said, yeah, everything that Achilles did, I approved of. I think that was good and he handled that right, essentially. So that leads me to think, because I think already that Plato, through Socrates, has such a problem with Odysseus, has such a beef with him, doesn't seem to particularly enjoy him, that we saw an apology. Socrates wants to get after it with Agamemnon and Odysseus, but he mentions Agamemnon first. So arguably he wants to go to Agamemnon and be like, fuck is wrong with you? Why did you sacrifice Iphigenia, which is not in the Iliad either, but it's another sort of implied context of, why exactly is Clytemnestra so angry with Agamemnon? Not just because he brings home a foreign queen with him and has been away for so long, and and Clytemnestra's cheating on him with Aegisthus and other. Is not just that; it's also the fact, likely, that he sacrificed his daughter in order to ensure their voyage, and therefore the sort of rage of a mother at the sacrifice of their child, which is reasonable. But then the Orestia is basically the story of Agamemnon returning home from war, thinking that he's safe, then ending up being sacrificed like one of the bulls that they sacrifice in all these rituals, being killed, and then his son Orestes having to then avenge his father's murder, yet his father's murder is his mother, therefore he has to avenge his father by essentially killing his mother, which he does, and then he goes on the run because he is now condemned for killing his mother, and the Erinyes chase him around and stuff, the wicked ones, and then they become the kindly ones afterwards, because there's a transformation where essentially Orestes is put on trial in Athens by the Athenians, led by Theseus, who presides over the trial, and he's found not guilty, and it's sort of this metaphor of the triumph of law and order over these sort of blood feud sort of things of the past. And again, it's sort of an image of Athens as sort of the city on a hill, this thing we're all aspiring to. And so it's so interesting then to get the Socrates opinion of, you guys are essentially full of shit. And so we're going to continue with Crito, continue going through the elements of it. But this was a good Page of Plato episode, where I think this is almost an hour and a half now, and we're really just chewing on details and going very, very slowly through the text. So you're not going to have a situation where you just hear me reading and you're going to get a rendition of the story in enough time that it's going to be succinct enough that you basically understand what I've said, and it's as if you read it yourself. Like, you're going to have to go back and read this yourself to get the fullest understanding of it, if that's what you're interested in. But again, I think it's interesting to go through this material, to go through the Plato line by line, and then when it's necessary to jump into the Iliad, Odyssey, etc., to really explicate the context of where some of Socrates' ideas essentially were coming from, what was informing him. And then, so we're going to get to this in Crito, but essentially, Crito will say to Socrates, what a strange dream, kind of point of like, hey, buddy, why are you putting so much status in this dream? And if we were to further analyze it, your understanding of Homer really is sophisticated, but almost sophisticated in the bad sense of rhetorical behavior and making an argument or using something for the sake of making an argument, therefore kind of rationalization based on the dream rather than any sort of rational analysis of it. But I think that's good enough for this time. So that's good for, I think this is podcast 24. So yeah, thanks.